Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Lexington Remembers.
World War II.
An intergenerational
oral history project.
The Lexington Public Schools.
And the Council on Aging.
I was at home listening to the radio, and the president came on and made his famous speech about the date that would remain forever in infamy. Our reaction was, how could they do such an awful thing?
How do you think we felt? That was devastating. It was totally unexpected. And it just left us shattered to think that the Japanese planes could make it.
At that time, I know we were just completely stunned. You can't imagine. We didn't have much television. We didn't have the television. We had the radio. I know. We could see it in the news that it was coming. To ask me what I felt about it, shock, just shock.
Well, I think right after Pearl Harbor was bombed, I think that aroused a great deal of animosity and patriotism in the people. So it was almost right away that people responded to that attack on Pearl Harbor.
It was a very quiet town. Certainly not as many people as we have now. Not as many scientists, and it was a bucolic setting, very quiet, very rural, and as I said, there weren't many scientists or engineers and whatever. We were just a simple, quiet little town.
At that time, Lexington was small enough where if you walked down the street in Lexington Center, you would know most of the people you came in contact with. You might not know them personally, but you would know who they were, and you'd know a lot of them personally. So it was nice. I liked it as a small town.
And Lexington Center was a lot different than it is now. We had just 3 banks in Lexington Center at that time. I think what do we have now, about 10? Oh, we had 1 drugstore, as I remember, and of course the 5 and 10, Woolworth's 5 and 10 was there, and we had a little Bo Peep shop, which was for children, and of course I used to go in there quite often, and we had a dry goods store and hardware store, but and a grocery store, but you know, not all the restaurants and banks that we have now.
There were 3 trains a day during 1940 from Lexington to Boston. In fact, Helen used to work in Boston. She used to take one of them to go to Boston and come home.
Yeah.
And at that time, there were 5 stations, railroad stations in Lexington. There was one at East Lexington, one at Pierce's Bridge, which is Maple Street, the Monroe Station, Lexington Center, and North Lexington up off of Bedford Street.
Do you know where the Theater Pharmacy is today?
Yeah.
It doesn't sell ice cream anymore. But back in the 40s, it had a soda fountain, and the ice cream cones were 5 cents.
In those days, the high school is not what you see today. The high school was down here on Mass Ave. It was junior high on one side and high school on the other. This is where the condominiums are. You know where the senior center is? That was the high school. Junior high on the left side, high school on the right. And there was a double door that separated the two. And believe me, if you stepped into the high school, some upperclassmen would let you know that you were just a baby and to get back on the other side.
Does anybody know where Alex Oil is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
Well, back in 1940, there was a big building there. They torn it down as what they call the Rest Inn. It was quite I think it had 28 rooms that people could rent rooms or stay for the night. That was a huge building.
It was. It was so large on the second floor or third floor.
Yeah.
They had a ballroom there, and the floor swayed.
It's
And
strong.
Yeah, it would sway.
Oh, it was interesting then, and it's also interesting now. We grow with the the years.
We all dug in and cooperated in every way we could. I happened to live in a community where everyone was community-minded and patriotic. Whenever there was a request, we were there, thinking about what we could do to help. Service, not for the recompense.
Yes, and there was a time when, you know, that people in this town thought we might be attacked by air raids. We had our air raid warning system. In fact, the first warning post, air raid warning post in Lexington, was the first one in the country, believe, that was manned 24 hours a day. And it was up opposite the Lexington Golf Course on what we call today Robinson Hill. And that was built soon after the beginning of the war, and it was manned 24 hours a day up there. We had a dim out, the blackout during the war, where each person had to have blackout curtains over the windows at night so that no light got through. You could buy this material in the department store, blackout material. And you had neighborhood air raid wardens who went around at certain times to make sure that you were obeying the regulations for blacking out your windows.
And so this is a warden sign, and I was a warden, and I had that in front of my house. You can see how it was in the ground. And at nighttime, the lights would be on until 11 o'clock at night, then shut them off. That's so that the enemy couldn't see Lexington. And so the air raid wardens, your grandmothers and grandfathers, they were air raid wardens too, and they went out at night and walked around a certain area, a certain district that they were supposed to go to, and if they saw an airplane coming, they would call it in to the town hall, and then town hall would report to Newton, and if they had more calls that there were airplanes coming, they would do something about it. But usually we did not have a conflict of that kind.
At night, when we had the lights on in the house, we'd have to pull the shades. We'd have to have dark shades and pull the shades down. And there used to be the wardens that would go around, you know, and if you didn't have your shade down, and if they could see light, then they would knock on your door and tell you to pull your shades down. And of course, gasoline was rationed for the cars, but not only that, they had to, if they were out at night, the headlights, they would have to have them painted like gray or something so that they wouldn't show brightly.
I remember now, but one of the men who worked in my office was killed in Boston, well, in Brookline he lived, just as a result of the war, because of the blackout. He was crossing the street. Of course, there were no street lights, and a car came along and killed him. So that was an indirect result of the war.
My worst memory, the air raids. My father was an air raid warden, and truthfully, we were not surprised. They didn't give us any surprise. But we always were afraid that maybe this is really the one. Maybe they will be dropping bombs this time. My mother would made black curtains to put in the windows when we had an air raid. You would have to put those curtains down, because I understand that even a flicker of a match outside or a candle could be seen from high in the sky. They were very scary because we sat in the dark. My father went out and patrolled the neighborhood, as did other men, and they made sure that there was no light showing anywhere on the streets.
Coming out, if I was late coming out, dark at night, and the sirens going off. Total darkness, nothing blacker than no lights, even from the towns all around you.
We used to help out at the Red Cross. We used to sew bandages, and we used to knit things, gloves and mittens and warm socks and send them over to the boys. And but they loved to get any letters or food, home-baked food.
I had one brother who was in the Pacific, New Caledonia, and the other three were in Europe. And we had to pack boxes of cookies and stuff like that to send to them. I imagine they were pretty stale by the time they got the cookies, all crumbs anyway.
I remember the Boston Globe used to produce a daily newspaper. Well, it came out, it couldn't have been daily, but about once a week they put out a newspaper, and I'd get as many copies as I could and mail them to different boys that I knew that were in the service, and they loved getting the news from home. It was a tiny little sheet, about 8 by 11, and they enjoyed getting the news from home. It was very hard on the young men. They were away such a long time.
Sending packages to the fellows overseas, we kept track of those in a club that I belonged to. We sent all kinds of packages to them. We had kept their names and addresses, their APO numbers, and that means Army post office numbers. And some other clubs in town did the same.
I used to send lots of things to my relatives in Norway because they didn't have anything. They were under, the Germans had taken over there. So I used to send clothes and food and different things over there to them to help them out.
When I was working in the Office of Price Administration, we had no days off except Sunday. And the only holiday we had off was Christmas. So we had no holidays. We had to work 6 days a week. And we, we did it. Yes, I wanted to join the WWII, but I was talked out of it. Because I was working in the Office of Price Administration, my family felt that I was helping in that way. But I really wanted to go. I really did. I often wished I had.
And they had knitting programs to make socks for the boys, and scarves and hats.
A group of us started knitting, and I think I knit and knit and knit at home at night for mittens and sweaters and helmets.
These were for the soldiers?
For the soldiers.
Oh, we did lots. I was in the 6th grade, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. We used to knit squares. Believe it or not, the boys and the girls would knit these little squares, 6 by 6 inch squares out of yarn, the boys as well as the girls, and we had enough of them. The teacher would sew them all together and made a big afghan out of it, and it was sent to the Red Cross, and they in turn sent them to the hospitals and the nursing homes. We also had paper drives for the war effort. We would gather papers, and we had to have them in bundles just so high so that they were easy to handle. We also had to save tins, our tins that green beans or whatever would come in. We would take the paper off, put the 2 ends inside the can, and then crush the can, and they would be picked up. We also rolled bandages for the Red Cross.
We had collections periodically in the town, as every town did, for we collected metal, junk metal and tin cans and so forth, which were reprocessed for the war effort.
And they had a big factory over in Waltham, and I remember one of the ladies in one of my neighbors, she was in her 70s or 80s, and she went off making things and working in the factories. Yeah, a lot of the women did factory work that men used to do, building, helping to build planes and everything, because so many of the men, and a lot of the older people, they started in working too. They had retired and they went back to work.
And of course, when a lot of the men were serving their country, that's when the defense plants started. All the women went to work in the defense plants.
We all felt that we had to pitch in and do what we could. And Union Carbide Company in Kendall Square in Cambridge desperately needed help, and it was mostly women. So I went down there to work in the milling department, and that was a dirty job because a conveyor belt brought you some little gadget, the name of which I don't remember anymore. And I was given a file and told, just do this and sort of polish off the roughness at the end of it. Well, everything was came through in oil. So when I went home at the end of the day, there was oil in my hair and oil on my hands and oil on my clothes.
We were all asked to buy war bonds to help support the war effort, and that was I think, very effective in making us aware of pulling together. The government apparently had the naive idea that it doesn't do a good, it isn't wise to have a deficit. And so they wanted to finance the war. They had to get a lot of money to pay for the war effort, pay for the soldiers and the armaments and the materiel. And so they tried to raise money, and the war bonds were a device for people loaning money to the government when the government needed it.
The war bonds that we were being urged to buy continually, and we had all kinds of drives here in Lexington to buy war bonds. We had a booth set up in the center, and there was all kinds of hoopla about it. The war bonds only paid 2.9% interest, which was very low. Anything today that pays 2.9% is considered absolutely awful.
The children were encouraged to buy thrift stamps. You've heard about the thrift stamp program? Has anyone talked about that? Those only cost 25 cents. And there was a regular program in all the elementary schools to invest and save money for all the children to do their part in saving. It was a real wonderful program. I wish it had been continued, because they were learning and they were contributing and they were patriotic.
I got drafted, that's right, yes. And when you get drafted, you go into the Army, and this is what they call a dog tag. That's a dog tag. They put that around your neck. And everybody in the service has one of these. Just put it around your neck, see?
Which shows you're getting drafted.
That's the way. And so, see, he's in the Army now.
I was in the Army Air Corps, in the fighter squadron in the Pacific. And we started in down near Australia and went all the way up to the different islands to Japan. It was quite an exciting adventure at times. We get bombed and strafed and shipwrecked, the whole thing, just like you see on television.
Do you know the invasion of Europe in Normandy? Well, I was in Normandy Beach, on Normandy Beach, 6 days after the invasion. And there was still a lot of resistance, and I was a medical department soldier. And while I didn't jump from any airplanes, because I was assigned to the 82nd Airborne, that's what I mean, the paratroops. I was supposed to meet them on the ground and take care of the wounded. And 6 days after I landed on Omaha Beach, after all of this fighting took place, I too was wounded.
I was first lieutenant. I got my wings in January of '44, and that was before I hadn't even learned to drive. My family didn't have a car, so I didn't know how to drive a car, but I got my wings.
In 1942, I entered the U.S. Navy for service. And I went to the North Atlantic, up to Iceland, Reykjavik, down to Casablanca, Africa, in Morocco, and to the South Atlantic, and then the Pacific in 3 years.
When I joined the service, I had only been out of Massachusetts twice in my life, and that was up to Old Orchard Beach in Maine by train. And so this was quite an eye-opening experience for me. I was young, and at that time I was 20, and I was really having time of my life, visiting all in London and England and France, Paris, and Brussels.
I was on an invasion ship out in the Pacific. I think I made 14 invasions across the Pacific. Our ship would run up on the beach and open the doors and drop a ramp, and we could carry 58 Army tanks and the Army men with them. They were called LST.
I was rather lonely when I was overseas in the Army because I had been married for 1 whole week. I have to say that I never had an argument with my wife for over 3 years because I wasn't home. Did I enjoy it? Yes, in as much as the people that I was working with were all young men that had been either through, finished college, or almost finished college. We had a lot of things to talk about. We had some interesting things to do, like set up transmitting stations that would service the 13th Air Force.
Yeah, there were 5 of us went in, and all of them were killed, but I was the only one who survived.
I was fortunate in that we were bombed, we were strafed, and they put a bomb right where my tent was, but I had left the tent at the time.
That's good.
I think so.
When we got out of the hospital, a Red Cross group and a USO group came by, and some dancing girls, there are such things, you know, danced on this flat bed, and it was very lovely and all of that. And I think what stood out most was the Red Cross donuts. We had donuts. That was more important than anything else. But other than that, we spent our days being cold and wet and scared.
I got shot down and I became a prisoner of war of the Germans in France. That's the closest we came to it. Fortunately, everybody else is okay.
How long were you a prisoner?
About 2.5 months. And then we were exchanged for some Germans. I was a prisoner in France, and so the front was advancing through France, and the Germans were in southwestern France were getting cut off, so they thought it wise to exchange us and get some Germans behind the lines with them.
What were the conditions like when you were captain?
It was a small camp. There were 19 Americans there, and 2 British and 1 French officer, and they weren't bad. It was a threatening environment, and they kept reminding us that they could take us out any time and shoot us. And once I got beyond the first, about 10 days, I was in solitary confinement because I wouldn't answer the questions. And once I got out of there, and I could be with the rest of the people, it was a little bit better. But in solitary, it wasn't too good because I was in a stone cell with 1 little window in it, and I slept on straw in the corner of the room, and at night when I lay down, I could hear the rats gnawing on the straw underneath it, so there was nothing dangerous there, but it was life-threatening, but it was unpleasant.
Our ship was all loaded for the invasion of Japan. We had all the Army trucks on it and the Army personnel on our ship at Okinawa to go across the ocean and invade Japan when they dropped the atomic bomb and the war ended.
You have to go be assigned to a ship, and I was sent to Boston, and I remember I went down to the dock, and I walked from one end of that ship to the other to see if there were any big holes in it.
They made 500 of my kind of ship, LST, first, and then when they were successful, they made 800 more, so it got up to 1,300 just LSTs. It's one kind of ship. Then we had Liberty ships that carried the troops across to Europe and to the Pacific and everything. They would hold loads of soldiers. So it was a great big effort by our country.
I was on what they call a Liberty ship when I first came over there. It was a ship built by Kaiser, who in those days put out hundreds of these Liberty ships. They were around 550 feet long, and they had a reciprocating steam engine, you know. You don't know what a reciprocating engine is. And they didn't go very fast, but the 1 load and they would have carried their worth. And I was on one of these, and when the Japanese came over and dropped bombs all around us, and the shrapnel was hitting the side of the ship, and we were 2 or 3 decks down, and it made quite a racket, and it was quite scary.
And you probably haven't heard of V-mail, have you? Well, we had special letters, envelopes in a little sheet, fairly small, and you would write on that. And that meant that you had to write a fairly short letter, which helps sometimes. And they would photograph that, and they sent all the film overseas. And then they would reproduce it somewhere over there and give it to me, or when it came the other way from overseas to here, then they would reproduce it.
I wrote letters home. They were on what they called V-mail, short one-sided gadgets, and that stood for victory mail. You couldn't say much, but you said it all, and you had to say it very carefully for 2 reasons. You couldn't violate secrecy, and you didn't want your family to worry. But those were the letters, and we got mail from home too, and they didn't violate secrecy, but they never told us when they had bad times, only the good times.
Life in Lexington was changed, and so we had rationing. And you see this card here? That's a rationing card. Yeah, and you had to go and get a rationing card, and they said, well, if you just do shopping around Lexington, we'll probably give you 10 gallons of gasoline. But if you work in Lawrence on a defense project, we'll give you 20 gallons. And if you work in Worcester, we'll give you 30 gallons of gasoline for a certain period. But you had to have a card to get gasoline. And even on food, if you went to the store to get food, you were lucky if you could find sugar. And if you could get it, you could only get 2 pounds. And also, so far as butter is concerned, you couldn't get butter. And so they had what we call oleomargarine.
Many things were in short supply. Butter, all the butter went to the armed forces. They earned it. They were working hard, risking their lives for us, so we didn't mind. But do you know what we used instead of butter? Oleo. But when you bought it at the store, it came in a little plastic container, and it was absolutely white. You know what margarine looks like today. You can't tell it from butter. And it's all scored into quarter sticks. Well, this had a little capsule. And I remember my youngsters, who were about 4, 3, and 2 years old, loved to take turns squishing the capsule and kneading the margarine. So finally, after about 5 minutes, it started to turn yellow. Then the trick was to knead it enough so it was a solid yellow instead of streaky with the white.
The more you kneaded it, the more like butter it became in color. But it tasted lousy.
Doesn't sound too good.
Oh, yeah,
it
tasted lousy.
Was it like dough, or was
No,
it
it lard, like lard.
Oh.
Like lard.
So it was very greasy.
Oh, it was terrible, so forget it. We had to stand in long lines to use our stamps, I think they were called, and you couldn't get butter. That's when they began to sell margarine, and then it was white, and they would give you a little packet of yellow coloring to mix into the white grease.
The rationing book was given to you by the federal government, and it was just a little stamp for certain things, probably about a ½ an inch in square. But those little stamps gave you the right to buy something. It wasn't free. They had meat rationing coins. They were little plastic coins about the size of a dime.
Meat was very scarce, and so we would have to eat tuna fish. That's where I ate so much tuna fish during the war, because there was so little meat.
You went to the meat counter, for instance, and there was no meat on the counter. You would ask for a pound of hamburger, and if they had it, they would get it. Now, I don't remember the cost, but it was probably not too much, probably maybe 50 cents a pound. But my mother would say, please ask for fish heads for the cat. We didn't own a cat, but my mother would take those fish heads and make a lovely, lovely soup or stew with that, with fish head stew. It was very good.
I remember once I had a bunch of college students. I taught college, and up at our place for a cookout. And I stopped down at the Faneuil Hall Market, and at a place where I'd been trading regularly, and bought some horse meat. And we cooked, you know, over the fire, we cooked out the horse meat, and I served that. And after dinner, after lunch, I overheard some of the girls, the wives of the students, talking about, they wondered where I got the black market horse meat. No, the black market meat. And I told them it wasn't black market, it was horse meat. And they were absolutely shocked. One girl certainly began to feel sick as soon as she heard it was horse meat she'd eaten.
Rubber was a big problem during World War II, and you had to have your tires on your automobiles inspected. If you wanted a new tire, you had to have it inspected to make sure that you were entitled to a new tire. And I think you might have been given some kind of a coupon or something to entitle you to a new tire. But when I say new, they weren't entirely new sometimes. Most of them were recap tires. People were restricted to how far they could go because of gasoline rations. You had your coupons, gasoline coupons. And you were, depending upon what you needed gasoline for, you were given 3 types of stickers for your windshield of your automobile. There was an A sticker, a B sticker, and a C sticker, as I remember. And each meant a different type of transportation for each individual. Now, an A sticker might have been for somebody who really needed gasoline, an emergency vehicle of some kind. And a C sticker might have been for somebody who just wanted to go shopping or something like that.
You had to walk a lot, yes.
Of course you walked, period.
You got your exercise, you walked.
I worked at the telephone company. I was a telephone operator. And we used to have plug-in phones like that, you know, and you have to say, number please, and so on, not like what you have now. I lived within walking distance of the telephone company, but I wanted to have a bicycle. I wanted to get a bike so I could ride back and forth. And we had to get permission from, in order to be able to buy a bicycle because they were rationed.
We couldn't get nylon stockings. We had to wear awful rayon, heavy stockings. You know, I mean, it isn't a hardship, but to, you know, after you've been used to nylons, not to be able to have them. And, you know, different clothing was rationed, and you just couldn't get things. But everything was thrown into the war effort. I mean, you didn't mind giving up things because you knew that the things were going towards winning the war.
Everything was rationed. You couldn't get, we couldn't get, for instance, nylon stockings, or silk stockings. The silk was sent to the Army or Air Force to make parachutes for the people who were parachutists. But those men came home with their silk, many of them with their silk parachutes. And their women, their girlfriends, would make their wedding gowns out of this material. We all had victory gardens, and those who had enough land. And what you would do is you grew as many vegetables as you could, and you would swap with another neighbor. If a neighbor had, for instance, a grape arbor, she might exchange a bushel of grapes or cherries from her tree for some vegetables that you had grown in your garden.
Any neighbor around that didn't have a garden, you picked tomatoes and brought them to them. If they had problems, the milk would be given to them by, it was a neighborly group. It was a very lovely neighbor, and as I say, there were things we were deprived of, but truthfully, in the country, we were far better off and more self-sufficient.
What did we do for fun in World War II? Well, you know, it was a time when there were a great many restrictions. There was a restriction on many forms of entertainment. It just was not available, but people still went to the movies in those days. And in fact, I think it was a couple of years after the war started that the selectmen granted permission for the movie house here in Lexington Center to open on Sundays. It had never opened on Sundays before then.
Of course, I tell you what we had. We had a movie in town.
My memories are that there were no men around. I remember looking around the center one day and thinking, there's no young men around at all.
We really didn't have much of a social life because there really wasn't much to do because all of our boys were gone and there was no one else to have a date with, so.
World War II was
a great deal of the entertainment was done in the clubs. We had a lot of nice clubs in Lexington, and there was a great deal of that entertainment. A lot of it was done. There was dancing.
One of the social centers in town was the Belfry Club. Now, that was at the corner of Forest Street and Muzzy Street. Okay, can you picture where that would be? And it had bowling alleys downstairs, tennis courts where there were champion matches, and the rest of it was used for, or they had a large hall for dances and for lectures, and many clubs used the Belfry Club. It burned down, unfortunately, in the 70s.
If you belonged to a club, probably somebody would take you up to like Fort Devens or someplace where the boys were stationed to a dance. And they had everything chaperoned up there, and they would keep you for a couple of hours and then bring you back home.
We used to go to USO dances in Boston, and that was a lot of fun, and see a lot more men in Boston than out locally.
Once a month up at the Bedford Airport, they would have a dance, and a bus would take us up. All the girls would go up and we'd dance with the soldiers up there. And they also had one that I used to go to in Boston, and for the ones that were around that way.
There used to be a place out in Newton called Norumbega Park, and there was a place there called the Totem Pole, and then all the young people from high school used to go over there to go to dances. Now there's a big Marriott motel over there in that place.
Well, Halloween here in Lexington those days, the principal of the high school lived on Winthrop Road or Highland Avenue, I forget which, and the kids used to throw pumpkins on top of his roof of his house and things like that. They didn't like the principal of Lexington High School those days.
We did the same things you do. We went around from door to door, and it wasn't so much trick-or-treating. It was more tricking than it was treating. But I do remember that there were a number of adults in town who catered to the young people. Dr. Shannon was a dentist here in town, lived up on Edgewood Road, and he always had open house Halloween night. Had cider and donuts for the youngsters there.
We used to do an awful lot more tricks than collect junk in paper bags.
What kind of tricks?
Oh, right on the windows with tallow candles and stuff like that. If we didn't like a person, we might cut their clothesline.
We just ran around and rang doorbells and ran. We didn't wait. Nobody gave us anything. And we'd go out, just go around the neighborhood, and we just thought that was, we'd have a party at somebody's house. But we didn't trick-or-treat like we do today.
We had lots of fun. Naturally, we were only allowed to go in the neighborhood, as I'm sure you children are allowed to go, only in the neighborhood to people we knew. And the people were very, very good to us. They had tables laden with candy and cakes and the whole thing. We had a great time.
Things tried to be normal. The way of life, they tried to carry on as best they could with the restrictions that I've outlined, the food restrictions and the transportation restrictions and so forth. But people did go to the movies for their entertainment, and they would have a party now and then, but you couldn't have too much partying because you didn't have the food to party with.
The town was really, it was one. All the different organizations acted as one.
It was a time of great patriotism. Every boy and man wanted to be in the war, wanted to be in the service. The country certainly never got ready for a big war in such short order as for World War II. It was amazing. Everybody was involved in it seemed.
People did not complain about serving their country, both men and women. And I remember in those days, when you had a man or a lady go into service, the mothers used to put little flags in their windows with blue stars, one for each person in service. And if she happened to lose a son or a husband, that was changed, that star was changed for a gold star. And she was called a Gold Star Mother. And she was very much honored. And she could hold her head high.
When the boys were drafted, there was a ceremony on the common. And all of the dignitaries in the town spoke. And they all had different views. And they told them about the glory of the war, and they were going to be everything they were going to be, not about the hardships. At the end of all these ceremonies, there was a priest, and he got up to give the invocation or the blessing to these boys that were going to be drafted. And he stood up and he hushed the whole common with a few words. And he said, "I do not agree with any of the former speakers in what they're saying." He said, "I believe that war is exactly what Sherman said. War is hell."
And you see these names up here? See, William Dunstan, Warren Booth, and the Buttrick boy, and the Burton boy, and Norman Hatfield. There are about 50 names up here on this in loving memory of those who gave their lives. That's in World War II. And these were high school graduates, you see, about 19. If you should look the ages, if you should check these down on the computer, these names here, you would find that those students were only out of the high school for probably 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 years from Lexington High School. Those were what they gave their lives for.
A high school classmate of mine who was the son of the superintendent of schools, you may have heard about that, volunteered, and he was one of the first to lose his life, Arthur Grindle.
When we have our reunions, like every 10 years, every 5 years, we have a class reunion, and they always mention the ones that were killed during the war. There were about 4 or 5 boys. When I graduated, it was a class of 200, and there were 4 or 5 boys that were killed.
My best memory was the closeness of the families. We all helped one another. We were just, we weren't the type of neighborhood, as I recall, that mothers would drop in for tea, but they were always there for you if you needed it.
Well, the best memory during the war was when peace was declared. Yes, when peace was declared, yeah.
I think that was the worst part of it, the loss of life. We knew that there were so many people dying. That was the tragedy of it all.
The most pleasurable? When it was over. I was in Okinawa. Have you heard of Okinawa? It's 600 or 700 miles south of Japan. Japan is made up of a series of islands, Honshu and various others. In Okinawa, it's called the Ryukyu chain. And we had word that the war was over, so all the aircraft and, all the ships in the harbor and anti-aircraft batteries all let go in celebration of the end of the war. And everything that went up had to come down, shrapnel. And we jumped into our foxholes and put the tops on, because when we came up, it was over. My tent was full of holes, my clothes were all full of holes.
On VE Day, when the Germans surrendered, I was in Saipan, water skiing in the harbor.
Everybody was kissing and hugging, and yeah, that was kind of nice. It was really nice. The restaurants were all crowded, and there was a lot of singing and everything. It was good. It was a good time. So we made up that day for all the dates that we didn't have when the war was on.
We drove into Cambridge and got on the subway and went to the Pops. And they were going to have some kind of a program, but that night they played all the anthems of all of the Allied troops, and we were right in the thick of it, and everybody was so happy, and everybody was talking to everybody, and it was just wonderful. It was just wonderful. And we were so glad it was over, and everybody, I was driving my brother-in-law's car, and he had Ohio plates on it. And so somebody tooted the horn and said, "You can go home now. If the war's over, you can go home." You know, and it was true.
Ship pulled into Boston, and I got off to come home, and I was thumbing a ride, and this fellow stopped. And he said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Lexington." I said, "But my parents don't know I'm coming home." He says, "Well, you've got to tell them. You might give them a heart attack when you walk in." So he made me stop, and he gave me a dime to make the phone call to home to let my parents know I was coming home.
I look back on it as a very favorable time in my life because it came out all right. And it's been a confidence builder for me. To learn to fly was exciting for me. It was to me quite an achievement and this sort of thing. And I've looked back on it since a lot of times in my life and thought, well, if I can do that, I can do whatever's facing me now. You know, I can get through this too. And so it's been a very positive experience in my life.
And so, on the GI Bill, which what they called college education for people who served honorably, I went to college, and I got 2 degrees, and I became a teacher, and then I entered a research laboratory at Hanscom, and then, well, I'm a grandfather, and I'm retired, and I can't believe any of this happened since I raised my hand and I said I would. So I'm telling you, whatever you do, enjoy it, because turn your back twice and it's gone. Somebody else is going to interview you for a program such as this, so it happens so fast.